At 7:42 that morning, my son texted, "Change of plans. Don't bother coming to the lake house this weekend. Uncle Rick's driving in from Tampa, and Mom wants it to just be the two of them with the grandkids." I read it once, then again, standing in my driveway with the truck already loaded. The cooler I'd packed the night before. The fishing rods strapped to the rack. 22 years of 4th of July weekends at that lake house, and this was the first text I'd ever gotten telling me not to come. I typed back 3 words, "Have a blast." Then I called my brother. I know how that sounds, calm, almost pleasant. Maybe you're picturing a man who should have called his ex-wife screaming, who should have driven up there anyway and made a scene in front of the grandkids. I didn't have that in me. 22 years teaches you that some fights are already over long before anyone sends a text. You just don't always know it in the moment. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years running an HVAC company outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, before I sold my share to my business partner 2 years back. Up until that text, I would have told you I had a complicated but workable relationship with my ex-wife Diane, the kind built on a decade of careful scheduling and civil holidays for the sake of our son Tommy and his kids. Not warm, not hostile, just managed. The cooler in my truck bed had a case of the root beer my grandkids liked, a bag of charcoal, and underneath all of it, a folder I hadn't shown anyone yet, blood work, an MRI report, a name I'd been carrying around in my chest for 6 weeks, waiting for the right quiet evening on that dock to tell my son. Early stage ALS. The lake house trip wasn't just a holiday to me. It was going to be the last easy weekend before I had to say the word out loud to people I loved. I'd planned that whole weekend for months, actually. Booked the 2 cabins closest to the water. Paid for the pontoon boat rental, the fireworks permit, catering for Saturday night, so Diane wouldn't have to cook for 12 people the way she always ended up doing. I'd covered nearly $9,000 of it myself, which nobody in that family questioned anymore, because I'd been the one quietly covering things for years. Rick, Diane's older brother, usually showed up for an afternoon, ate, and left before dinner. He and I had never had much use for each other, but I'd tolerated him fine for 2 decades because he was family, technically. Then a few weeks back, Tommy mentioned that Rick had been staying with Diane more, helping her around the house since his own divorce. I figured he'd come Saturday, same as always, wave hello, eat a burger, disappear by 6. I never once pictured him camped out for the entire weekend, taking my spot at that lake house I'd rented every summer since Tommy was in middle school. That text told me otherwise. I didn't throw my phone into the lake, though I thought about it. I didn't slam the tailgate shut hard enough to dent it, even though I could have popped that dent back out with a rubber mallet in 10 minutes. I just stood there in my driveway with the cooler still in my hands, and I thought about something that had never quite landed on me so clearly before. For 22 years, since the day Tommy was born, I was the man everybody called when a pipe burst at 2 in the morning, when Diane's furnace died in January, when Tommy needed a truck to move apartments. But the second her brother needed a soft place to land after his own divorce, I became the man who could be uninvited from a holiday I was paying for. Diane texted again a minute later. "Please don't make a thing of this. Rick's had a rough year." I read that line about 4 times. And here's what stuck with me. Rick had had plenty of rough years. I'd been there for most of them too, actually. Co-signed his truck loan back in 2011, let him sleep on my couch for 2 weeks after his first divorce. None of that seemed to count for much. Once there was a lake house with my name on the reservation and an empty cabin he could move into instead. I called my attorney, a guy named Harold Pruitt, who'd handled every contract for my HVAC company for almost 18 years. He'd heard me ask him about liability waivers, supplier disputes, one nasty lawsuit from a customer whose basement flooded. He'd never heard me ask what I was about to ask. I didn't tell him I wanted to punish anybody. That's not really who I am. I told him, I want to know exactly what's mine, what's tied to Diane, and how I walk away clean. Harold told me to sit on it for a day, not to act while I was angry. I told him I'd had 22 years to get here, and there was nothing sudden about it. Saying that out loud surprised even me, because it happened to be true. I'd been thinking about selling the lake house for over a year already. I owned it outright, bought it 8 years before Diane and I split, and the divorce settlement had spelled it out in plain language, separate property, no claim on either side. I hadn't structured it that way out of distrust. I'd done it because in my line of work you learn to plan for the pipe that hasn't burst yet. I opened the booking accounts that night. I couldn't get back everything I'd already paid. The deposits were gone. But I could stop what hadn't happened yet. I canceled the pontoon rental, pulled my payment off the catering order, called the fireworks vendor, and told them the display was off. My phone buzzed almost immediately after, Diane's name lighting up the screen over and over. I turned it face down on the kitchen counter and left it there. By the time Diane, Tommy, and the grandkids pulled up to that lake house Friday evening, they still thought they'd swapped one guest for another. They had no idea they'd lost the man who'd been quietly holding the whole weekend together, financially and otherwise, for 8 straight summers. I couldn't touch everything. The cabins themselves were booked under Diane's name that year, something about a loyalty discount tied to her credit card, so those reservations were untouchable from where I sat. But the boat, the catering, most of the fireworks display, all of it had gone through my accounts. I canceled what I could and stopped paying on what I couldn't. The deposit insurance clawed back some of it, not all. I won't pretend there wasn't a small, ugly satisfaction watching those refunds process. $9,000 doesn't vanish painlessly for anybody, retired contractor or not. But underneath the money, there was something close to relief. For the first time in a long while, I was willing to pay actual cash for the privilege of not being taken for granted. Diane called from the lake house parking lot, once, then 4 more times. The text started soft. "Walt, please, let's talk about this like adults." Then they turned sharp fast. "Walt, the caterer says our order's been canceled. This is humiliating in front of Rick." Humiliating. That was the word she reached for. Not hurt, not confused about why I'd be upset. Humiliating, like I'd shown up underdressed to something. Tommy's text landed a few minutes after that. "You don't have to ruin everyone's weekend just because you're mad." I read that one twice, sitting alone in a house that felt about 4 sizes too big for one person. Not once did he ask if I was okay. Not once did he ask what had actually happened to make me cancel anything in the first place. Just that my being upset was inconvenient for people trying to enjoy their holiday. I answered him once. "You wanted Rick there instead of me. Let Rick figure out the boat and the fireworks." I didn't hear back after that. Rick ended up covering part of the shortfall on a rental boat he found last minute, grumbling about it from what Tommy told me later. They still had their weekend. For a couple days, I think they told themselves I'd thrown a small tantrum, and everything would smooth itself out once everyone got home. I want to tell you about 3 moments, because listing 22 years of showing up would take all night, and honestly, 3 is enough to get the shape of it. The first, Tommy was 9, running a fever of 104 on a Tuesday night in February. Diane was working a double at the hospital. I called Rick first. This was back when he still occasionally picked up and got nothing. So I sat on the edge of Tommy's bed all night, and around 2 in the morning I drove him to the emergency room myself. When the fever finally broke and he came out of that fog, he grabbed my finger with his whole little hand and said, "Don't leave, Dad." That was the first time in months he'd call me that instead of Walt, which he'd started doing to feel grown up. The second, his college graduation. I'd quietly covered the last 2 semesters after his financial aid fell through, and he was too proud to ask outright. Never mentioned it, just paid it and let it be. Rick showed up late that day with an expensive watch as a graduation gift, and somehow ended up front and center in every photo. When the photographer called for one with the parents, Tommy pulled his mother and Rick in close. I stood off to the side, holding his cap in my hand like a coat check attendant. The third, last Father's Day, Tommy posted a long tribute online to Rick. "No matter how much time we lost, you've always shown up when it counted." On my porch that morning, he'd left me a card that said, "Thanks for always being reliable, Walt." Not Dad, just reliable. I sat with that a long while before I ever mentioned it to Harold. I went into Harold's office and laid it all out. Prepare the sale paperwork. Confirm the lake house title was still clean. Exactly the way I remembered it. Move forward on listing it. I'd been circling this for over a year already. Harold leaned back in his chair and asked, "You want Tommy to have a chance to walk this back before we file anything?" I told him Diane and Tommy had already made their choice before the truck was even loaded. He slid a folder across his desk. "One thing you should understand before you sign. This isn't a message to anybody. This is your life changing." I picked up the pen. My hand shook just enough that the signature came out crooked at the end. Harold noticed. His eyes flicked up, then back down, and he didn't say a word about it, which I appreciated more than he probably realized. 6 weeks before any of this, I'd sat in a neurology office on the east side of Scranton, in one of those rooms with the harsh overhead lighting and a laminated poster of the nervous system stuck slightly crooked on the wall. The doctor had a gentle way of delivering hard news, which I respected even as I hated every word of it. The symptoms are mild right now, he said, but we need to start planning for what's ahead, not just the next few months. Early stage ALS. I'd noticed things myself before he ever said it out loud. A slight weakness gripping a coffee mug, my handwriting shrinking down on invoices until my old office manager asked if I needed new glasses. A stumble coming down my own porch, steps that I'd chalked up to getting older until it happened one too many times to shrug off. I hadn't told Diane, and Tommy even less. Not from distrust. I wanted to understand exactly what I was facing before I put that weight on anybody else. I wanted facts, not fear. That lake house weekend was supposed to be when I finally told them. Sat Tommy down at the dock after the grandkids went to bed, because a diagnosis like that touches a whole family, whether they're ready for it or not. I'd packed for it. New medication tucked in with the sunscreen. Paperwork folded inside a manila envelope at the bottom of my duffel bag. A separate sheet, handwritten, listing changes I'd eventually need around the house: ramps, grab bars, a stair lift if it came to that. I wasn't afraid of the disease itself, not exactly. What scared me was becoming a burden. I'd watched my own father lose himself slowly after his stroke. Watched a man who built houses with his hands need help buttoning his own shirt. I thought Diane and Tommy would be my people through something like that. I really did. That text about Rick cracked something open in me. And what spilled out was this. They still saw me as the man who kept the weekend running, not a man who might soon need the family to run things for him instead. A few weeks before all this, Diane had noticed my hand trembling over dinner and asked, "You sure retirement's agreeing with you? You seem restless." She never asked about my health. She asked about my mood, about whether the new schedule was making me difficult to be around. I didn't hold it against her at the time. Looking back now, I understand I'd been quietly ignoring a lot of small signals, telling myself they didn't mean what they clearly meant. Here's the moment that really shifted things for me. While they were up at the lake, Diane butt-dialed me during a call with Rick. 2 full minutes recorded straight into my voicemail. Her voice came through easy, almost fond. "He'll cool off. Walt always does." Rick asked something back I couldn't quite catch. "And if he doesn't," she laughed, "he's not going to walk away from Tommy and the grandkids. That man built his whole life around being needed." That line did more damage than any insult could have, because she wasn't wrong about who I used to be. She understood me completely. She just only understood the parts of me she thought she could still use. I went back to Harold's office and signed everything. Listing agreement, updated will, beneficiary changes, revoked access on the shared accounts we still had for Tommy's benefit. My hands shook through every signature, and this time I didn't try to hide it. Harold asked, "Does Diane know about the diagnosis?" "No. You going to tell her?" I looked down at my own signature, nowhere near as steady as it used to be. I was planning to tell my family. I wasn't sure anymore that I still had one in the way I'd meant it. He told me the sale itself would take about 3 weeks to fully close, not days like I'd hoped. "That's fine," I told him. They'd be gone 11 days total between the lake house and Diane's usual week visiting her sister after. The rest could happen through his office while I wasn't standing in the middle of it. Truth is, I'd been circling the idea of selling that lake house for over a year before any of this happened. It was 5 bedrooms for a man who used it maybe 6 weeks a year now that Tommy was grown. The dock stairs worried me more every month, given what the doctor had said about balance further down the road. I'd already gotten a preliminary appraisal done, already talked to a couple who'd been asking around the lake community for a place just like mine, already had the title pulled and reviewed. That text didn't create a plan. It just used up the last of my hesitation about one I already had sitting ready. I accepted an offer about 10% under what I could have held out for, in exchange for a clean, fast close, and the buyers agreeing to take most of the furniture as is. 21 days, no repairs required, no strangers walking through while I stood outside pretending not to watch. 21 days meant it could be handled quietly before anyone got back from the lake and Diane's sister's place afterward. Harold's office handled every notification properly. Email, certified mail, digital copies of everything, a clear window for Diane to collect whatever personal items she still kept up there. All of it above board. Nothing sneaky in any of it. Diane saw the subject line of that first email while she was still at the lake. She told me later she figured it was me trying to rattle her into calling. She never opened it. Texted instead, "We'll deal with this when everyone's home. Don't do anything you'll regret." I didn't answer that one either. When the movers came, I want to be clear about something. I didn't throw away a single item that wasn't mine. A professional crew packed up what belonged to Diane and Tommy from that house. Old kids' art projects still taped to the fridge, photo albums from a decade of summers, kitchen things Diane had picked out over the years. Every bit of it went into a climate-controlled storage unit, paid 6 weeks in advance. What I kept for myself was small. My own father's old fishing tackle box, a photograph of Tommy at 9 years old, grinning with a bass nearly as big as he was, a hand-carved duck decoy I'd made the summer before Tommy was born, my medical file. That was about it. I left the big furniture, since the new owners wanted it anyway. Cleaner that way. There was one moment that got me, though. I walked through what used to be Tommy's room at that lake house one last time. Empty now, except for the height marks still penciled on the closet door frame. Age 9, age 12, age 15, climbing steadily up the wood in my own handwriting. Next to the last one I'd written, taller than me, finally. I ran my thumb over that line but didn't take a picture of it. Some things don't need to leave with you to still be real. They just stay where you left them. My neighbor Gene came out while the moving truck loaded up. Known him nearly as long as I'd owned that lake house. "Diane know about this?" he asked, nodding at the truck. "Her lawyer does. Her inbox does. Whether she knows depends on whether she bothers to open it," I told him. He asked where I was headed next. "Somewhere smaller, with fewer stairs to worry about," I said, and meant it mostly as a joke. I found a small ranch house near Harvey's Lake, 1 floor, a covered porch, close enough to my new neurologist that appointments wouldn't eat my whole day, a garage with just enough room for my dad's tackle box, and an old canoe I'd been meaning to restrip finish for years. I changed my main phone number and kept one email open strictly for Harold. The last thing I did before handing over the keys to the lake house was leave an envelope on the kitchen counter. Not a stunt. Inside was the storage unit address, copies of the legal paperwork, cash to cover a hotel for a couple weeks, and a letter I'll get to. I locked that door one final time and handed the keys to the new owners, a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever barking from their car. They shook my hand and thanked me. I told them to enjoy the place, and I meant that too. While I was signing away keys back in Scranton, Diane, Tommy, and the grandkids were finishing out their week at the lake, then heading to Diane's sister's place in Maryland like they did every summer. For a few days, from the outside anyway, everything looked exactly like what Tommy said he wanted. A photo landed on Diane's page of her, Tommy, the grandkids, and Rick captioned, "The family time we've needed for a while now." I didn't go looking for it. Gene sent me one picture before catching himself and apologizing. "Don't send me any more," was all I told him, and he didn't. But cracks show up fast once the person quietly holding things together steps back. And Rick, as it turned out, had never really held much of anything together in that family, not once. He'd covered the boat rental with his card, but the griping started almost immediately after. He skipped out on the grocery runs when he could, told Tommy he ought to chip in for gas on the drive to Maryland, since Rick was already stretched thin. Got visibly irritated when Diane brought up gently what their living situation might look like once everybody got back. And there was no lake house waiting for next summer. One evening at Diane's sister's table, Tommy brought up a memory from when he was 12. A broken arm from a bike accident, a long night in urgent care. Rick smiled and said, "Yeah, I remember that one." "Which arm was it?" Tommy asked. Rick guessed wrong. Tommy knew, because I'd been the one holding the door open while they set the cast. Diane finally opened the email from Harold's office on day 9 of the trip. She tried calling me. The number didn't connect anymore. She called Harold instead, and he told her calmly that all communication needed to go through her own attorney from here forward. She hung up, rattled, tried to keep it from Tommy so it wouldn't ruin the last few days of the trip. Rick told her not to worry about it. "He's bluffing," he said. "Guys like Walt need people to take care of. He'll come around once he's home alone for a week." That line landed strange on Diane, though she couldn't place why right away. It was close to word for word what she'd said herself in that voicemail, that I'd never really leave, that I'd built my whole life around being needed by somebody. Hearing it aimed back at her, coming out of someone else's mouth, seemed to shift something loose. Tommy found out about the lake house by accident, catching the paperwork open on his mother's phone screen. "He sold it because we wanted Rick there instead," he said, sharp, angry. "Don't act like Rick replaced anybody." Diane snapped back, quieter than she meant to. Tommy went quiet after that. I think it was the first time the weight of what he'd actually asked for landed on him at all. Rick tried smoothing it over. Your dad's trying to guilt you with money, he told Tommy. Tommy asked him plainly, where's everybody supposed to stay this winter if the lake house is really gone? Rick had nothing. We'll sort it out, he said, the kind of answer a man gives when he's never once had to actually sort anything out for somebody else in his life. That was, as far as I understand it, the first time Rick had ever been asked to produce a real plan instead of a nice gesture. He didn't have one. By the last night at Diane's sister's place, nobody was posting photos anymore. Rick and Diane had a quiet, tense argument in the kitchen about money that carried through the thin walls. Diane sat out on the back steps that night looking at nothing in particular, starting to understand that the lake house really might be gone for good. What she hadn't figured out yet, not by the time they packed the car for the drive home, was that Rick had never intended to become the man she'd swap me out for. He'd only ever intended to be the man who showed up for the easy weekends. They drove back into Scranton on a Sunday afternoon. Rick had come along mostly because Diane pushed him into it, wanting him there to help talk to me, as if this were still a conversation that could be smoothed over with enough people in the room. Tommy noticed the lake house first, technically, though of course it was 200 miles behind them by then, and none of them knew yet. What they noticed was my house, the one in Scranton, empty, a sold sticker already peeling off a sign at the curb that had gone up faster than anyone expected. A different car sat in the driveway, a basketball hoop nobody in our family had ever owned. Diane tried her key. It didn't turn. A man she'd never met stepped out, calm, a little apologetic, and explained that he'd bought the house through a straightforward closing, that everything had already been finalized. Diane called the police out of pure disbelief. When they came, they checked the paperwork, confirmed nothing illegal had happened, and asked her to step off private property that wasn't hers anymore. No furniture thrown on the lawn. No locks changed spitefully in front of anybody. Everything they owned sat safely in that storage unit 40 minutes away, paid through the end of next month. It made me look prepared, not cruel. That distinction mattered to me even from a distance. Diane turned to Rick. We can stay with you until this gets figured out. Rick lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. My lease doesn't really allow for long guests, he said without much hesitation. Not even me? Tommy asked. I didn't say that, Rick backtracked. I just need a little time. Time? The same word he'd been handing Tommy his whole childhood, dressed up in new clothes. The new owner of the house walked out holding an envelope. Inside was the storage unit address and enough cash for a couple weeks at a motel. Diane read the letter standing right there on what used to be our front lawn, Tommy close beside her. Diane, you wanted Rick there instead of me this year, and I understand why that felt easier for you. I didn't sell your home. I sold the house I bought and paid off myself, and the lake house I'd already been planning to let go of, because my health is changing in ways I hadn't told either of you yet. Your things are safe in storage, paid through next month. Harold has every document you'll need. I spent a long time believing that showing up reliably would eventually make me feel like family instead of just useful. Your message showed me that in your eyes, I was still the man who could be set aside the moment somebody easier came back around. I don't wish either of you harm, but I won't spend what's left of my good years financing a life where I'm treated as optional. Take care of yourselves. Walt. Diane stopped cold on the line about his health changing. She thought back, my hands shaking at dinner, the way I'd started avoiding the lake house dock stairs, the vague doctor's appointments I'd mentioned only once and never brought up again. What does he mean, his health? Tommy asked. Diane didn't have an answer. For the first time in 22 years, they were both realizing I'd had an inner life neither of them had bothered to ask enough questions to find. Rick tried shifting the blame. This whole thing was planned. This is manipulation. Tommy turned on him, quiet but sharp now. What medication is he even on? Rick didn't know. What doctor's he seeing? He didn't know that either. What was I dressed as for Halloween when I was 6? Rick had nothing. Tommy stood there on a lawn that used to be his, realizing his uncle hadn't just failed to know me. He barely knew Tommy either. Rick left not long after, citing some work call he needed to take. Diane and Tommy checked into the motel I'd paid for. That night, Tommy sat on the edge of the bed holding an old photograph he'd pulled out of a box in storage, himself at 9, asleep against my shoulder after that hospital run all those years back. On the back, in my handwriting, my boy's finally resting easy. Tommy broke down. He thought I was his whole world. Diane put a hand on his back. He didn't just think it, she said quietly. He built his life around it. 5 months passed. I used part of the money from the lake house to start a small trade apprenticeship fund through the local vocational school, HVAC certifications for kids who couldn't afford the coursework otherwise. Not for recognition. I'd hired plenty of young guys over the years who had real talent and no way to pay for the license. I knew what a fair shot could do for somebody like that because I'd been one of them once, 40 years back. They held a small ceremony in the school's auditorium. I got asked up to say a few words about steady work, about the kind of life you build slowly out of things that actually last. Diane read about it in the local paper and came, bringing Tommy. Rick showed up too, mostly because Tommy had asked him to. Wanting to see, he told him later whether Rick was capable of showing up for something that wasn't easy. After I finished speaking, Diane walked toward me through the small crowd. She didn't raise her voice. Her tone stayed low, controlled. You had enough money to fund strangers' educations, but you left your family in a motel. I left you storage, legal notice, and 2 weeks paid at a motel. I said, what I stopped giving you was unlimited access to the rest of my life. She said I'd humiliated them in front of people. No, I told her. I stopped hiding the consequences of a decision you made in a text message, out loud, where people could see it. Tommy stepped closer. Dad, he said. I didn't go cold on him. I looked at him a long moment before I answered. I loved hearing you call me that when you were 9, I said. His eyes filled up. I was stupid and I was thoughtless, he said. You were old enough to choose that weekend, I told him. That means you're old enough to sit with what the choice cost. He asked me to come back, not to the marriage, just back into their lives, back to how things used to run. I loved you like my own son for 22 years, I said. But loving you doesn't obligate me to keep accepting whatever spot you decide to give me on any given weekend. That's when Rick stepped in like he had any standing to. This has gone far enough. Tommy's got 2 father figures in his life. That's all this is. I wasn't interested in litigating that. I just asked him what Tommy majored in at school. Wrong answer. What Tommy was allergic to. Nothing. Tommy asked him to stop, but Rick kept going, blaming Diane for keeping him at arm's length all those years. Diane answered that one right there in front of everybody. I called you for help constantly, Rick, for over a decade. I had my own stuff going on, he said. Tommy looked at him steady now. Walt had his own stuff going on too. He still showed up. That was really the moment it settled for everyone standing there. No dramatic reveal, no scene, just a plain, quiet fact sitting out in the open. Rick had a title. I had a history. And it turns out a title doesn't hold a family together by itself. Tommy asked about my health then, gently, like he actually wanted to know rather than needed something from me. I told him the truth. Early stage ALS, manageable for now, treatment already underway. Diane's response came fast. Then let us help you. You don't get to become my caretakers because you feel guilty about a text message, I said. Trust doesn't rebuild itself in one conversation in a school parking lot. I didn't close the door completely, though. I gave Tommy a P.O. box address. Not my house. Write to me, I told him. Don't ask for money. Don't ask me to fix anything. Just tell me who you actually are when you don't need something from me first. He nodded, tears running, and I turned back toward the students waiting to take pictures with the man who'd helped fund their certifications. I caught Tommy's face out of the corner of my eye, watching me stand among those kids who knew exactly what I'd done for them and why. I think that was the first time he really saw me. Not as the man who kept his family's weekends running smoothly, but as a man standing on his own 2 feet, worth something apart from what he could provide. A year has gone by now. I'm still in that little ranch house near Harvey's Lake. Life isn't perfect there. Some mornings my hands are steadier than others. Some days the medication leaves me slow and foggy by the afternoon. I've had to learn, the hard way, how to actually accept help instead of just handing it out to everyone else first. There are evenings when the quiet in that house gets loud enough to sit heavy in my chest. But it's a different kind of quiet than I expected going in. It doesn't feel like loneliness the way I thought it would. It feels more like room to actually breathe. These days I go to physical therapy twice a week. I mentor a handful of the trade students through the apprenticeship fund. Nothing formal, just coffee and honest conversation about work and building a life that holds up. Jean and I still fish most Saturdays, same as always. I still tinker in the garage, restoring that old canoe, fixing small things that don't strictly need fixing, just because my hands still like the work while they still can. I'm not a healthier man than I was a year ago, and I'm certainly not a richer one. But I stopped being afraid that being loved meant I had to keep buying my place at the table. That's worth more than either of those other things. Diane moved into a small apartment across town and picked up extra shifts. She's not struggling exactly, but for the first time in a long while, she's had to build her own budget, call her own repairman when the water heater goes, handle her own life without a wall attached to the hard parts of it. She sent me a letter a few months back. No demands in it, no request to get back together, just an apology, plain and unadorned. I wrote back and told her I forgave her. I also told her clearly that whatever we'd had was over. Both things were true at once, and I've come to believe they usually are. Rick drifted back out of the family once Tommy stopped looking at him, like something out of a story he'd been telling himself. This time, Tommy didn't go chasing after him. He told me once that wanting Rick around growing up was never really the mistake. The mistake was treating a man who'd shown up for him every single day for 22 years like something replaceable the second an easier option walked in the door. Tommy writes to me regularly now. The early letters were mostly apology, and I answered those politely, nothing more. Eventually, he stopped writing about the past and started telling me about his actual life instead. A promotion at work, a night class he was taking, some hours he'd put in helping out at the trade program himself. After a few months of that, I agreed to meet him for coffee. He didn't call me Dad right away. He just said, "Thanks for meeting me, Walt. Thanks for coming without needing me to fix anything," I told him. It wasn't some big reunion. It was just a small, honest start. Back home that evening, I opened my father's old tackle box, the one I'd carried from that lake house to this one. The photograph of Tommy at 9 was still tucked inside, a little soft at the corners now. I didn't throw it out. I never will. Forgiving somebody doesn't mean pretending the love you had for them wasn't real. But I didn't set it out on the nightstand either. It stayed right there in the box, alongside the other things that belong to a life I've already lived through once. For most of my life, I believed love meant staying no matter how little of yourself was left standing by the end of the day. I know better now. Sometimes love means walking away before resentment turns you into somebody you don't recognize in the mirror anymore. They thought I disappeared to punish them. The truth is simpler than that. I disappeared because for the first time in 22 years, I finally understood my life belonged to me too. Forgiveness opens the door back up. Boundaries are what decide how far it's allowed to swing. If you've ever had to walk away from somebody you loved just to hold on to who you were, I'd honestly like to hear what that taught you. Thanks for sticking with me through this one, and take care of yourselves out there.